Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Ann Peters from the Pulitzer Center, and I'm very glad you are joining us today as we consider the impacts of voter suppression and voter ID laws on voter participation throughout the United States, along with their disproportionate effects on marginalized communities. As we wait for folks to join us, please let us know in the chat where you're listening in from. Our session today is part of the Pulitzer Center's Focus on Justice online series. And while this session is the last for the summer of 9 that we've had, it is not the last time we'll be focusing on the important topics we've covered, from asylum to public defender and bail system to mass incarceration itself. And as we highlighted earlier this summer, one of our aims for the fall is also to continue these conversations. And we'll also be offering virtual performances, for example, of Sarah Short's play, The Box, which focuses on solitary confinement. We believe it is critical, especially at this moment in our history, to keep issues of justice at the forefront of our reporting and of our conversations. And also learning. Associated with our session today, for example, you can learn more on pulitzercenter.org about frequently asked questions folks have regarding voting issues for the general public. And also a lesson plan designed for middle and high school students, their teachers, and their parents, who will be continuing to teach them at home in a lot of cities this fall. We're seeing a lot of folks throughout telling us where they're coming in from. We have folks from San Francisco, from Leesburg, Virginia, Madison, Connecticut, Madrid, Spain, welcome from around the world, West Virginia, Nevada. Really thanks for joining us today. If you don't know about the Pulitzer Center, I just want to fill you in a bit before we get to our conversation. We're a nonprofit journalism and education organization based in Washington, D.C., supporting more than 170 reporting projects each year on global and local issues. You can also look under themes, our reporting issues page, which brings together this work on such topics as racial justice, environment and climate change, migration, and public health. We have a strong university program with more than 35 partner schools that offers connections with journalists and offering reporting fellowships to students. We also work on the K-12 front, as I mentioned, by our lesson plans, and also direct outreach to students and professional development for educators. And we organize these public events and webinars. A few logistics. All of our attendees are muted, but if you can't hear us at any time, please let us know via the chat box. And we are really excited to hear about your questions. So after the conversation, we'll have a time for Q&A. Please put your questions into the Q&A icon box on your screen. Go ahead and start right away if something pops into your mind and you want to get that in the queue. We want to let you know we're also recording this session to post online for others who could not be with us, and we'll be sharing additional links that our guests today have also shared with us. Finally, if you would like to tweet and put this information out via social media, please use the hashtag #JusticeFocus. One additional final note, we'll have a brief survey at the end, so please stay on once we're ready to wrap up. And now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers today. Journalist Brittany Gibson, attorney Tori Wenger, a Skadden Fellow at NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and Dr. Brenda Williams of Sumter, South Carolina. Brittany is a British-American journalist, currently a writing fellow at the American Prospect magazine in Washington, D.C. She graduated with her bachelor's in journalism and media studies and art history and a minor in French language from Rutgers. Previously, she was an intern with the New York Daily News and CNN International in London. Her work covers varying subjects and beats, but all her stories, as she says in her bio, originate from an innate sense of curiosity about how the world works and a desire to share people's stories. Tori Wenger is, as I mentioned, a Skadden Fellow for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, focusing on voting rights matters. She graduated from New York University School of Law, where she was a Furman public policy scholar. Her other law school achievements include participating in NYU's Civil Rights Clinic, as well as clinics with the American Civil Liberties Union, and being a student fellow at NYU Center on Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. Before going to law school, Tori focused on voting rights and police accountability while working at the Advancement Project in Washington, D.C. Dr. Brenda C. Williams is a retired primary care physician from Savannah, Georgia. In 1982, she and her husband, Dr. Joseph Williams, opened the Excelsior Medical Clinic in Sumter, South Carolina, and ran that practice for 32 years. Both Dr. Williams are active in community affairs, and soon after retirement, they established the Family Unit, an organization focused on improving the living conditions of impoverished people in Sumter. Inspired by President Obama in 2008, Dr. Brenda Williams and members of the Family Unit started registering people to vote, from mobile home parks to low-income housing projects and at the local jail. So now I'd like to hand the microphone over to Brittany Gibson to start our conversation.
Thank you so much, and it's really a pleasure to talk and share this reporting. The timing of today's webinar is really apt. It's the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, and with the recent passing of John Lewis, I think a lot of us are looking back at the stories of Selma and the fight for voting rights to be free and fair and accessible to people across the country, which is interesting, especially because I first started this reporting and received support from the Pulitzer Center, because reporting on voting rights and voter suppression starting in the primaries, it was an underreported story. And today even the President of the United States is tweeting about absentee ballots. So it's totally gone to the mainstream, completely flipped from when I started in early February. And when I did start this reporting, I have to admit, I was not an expert by any means. I don't have formal training in this, and the history is something I found more through curiosity. As I said in my bio, that's really what drove this reporting and drove me to seek out the stories that I found in my reporting. And it was this curiosity that led me to the Pulitzer Center and for their support and funding. I started this reporting following the primaries in South Carolina, then moving to Alabama, then moving to Missouri. And because I wasn't an expert, I really relied on what I joke and call ambassadors to my reporting, my sources for these stories. And that includes, of course, Dr. Williams, who gave me the on-the-ground situation, lay of the land in South Carolina, and Tori, who was able to give me the big picture and the zoom out of everything happening in the country, as well as where that fits in the US's voting history. So I want to start with Dr. Williams. You have a very long history of activism and advocating for people's voting rights. Back from when you had your practice, you would, even ask your patients, how's it going? You registered to vote.
Yeah.
So could you tell me a little bit about what it was like when you were first registering people back in 2008?
I would be more than happy to tell you about the journey that has been undertaken in registering people to vote in the state of South Carolina. It hadn't been easy. However, it is extremely important. As you mentioned, my husband and I are physicians in South Carolina, Sumter County, and we had always registered our patients to vote. We started our private practice in June of 1982. We were born and raised in the South, in Georgia. We were well accustomed to prejudice, racism, disenfranchisement, even as children. And so when we got married 45 years ago now, and we started our practice 32 years ago, we took the opportunity to register people when they came into our office, asking them, were they registered voters, explaining to them why it's very, very important. And as a result of that, it became a common practice at Excelsior Medical Clinic to enfranchise our patients, most of whom were African American. About 85% of our patient population were African Americans, and the other percentage were of other races. Well, in 2008, when Barack Obama former President Barack Hussein Obama ran, I was just very, very impressed. Matter of fact, we were. And we wanted to go outside the office, outside the walls of a medical practice, into the community. And not just to any area of the community. We looked for areas that were historically disenfranchised, lower income housing projects, trailer parks, the jail, local jail. And we focused primarily on these individuals who had been left out, whose voices were not heard. And it was, and still is, a journey. Instructing people about voting in themselves, learning about primaries, general elections, and absentee voting. Most of the individuals at our jail, as a matter of fact, about 98% of the individuals incarcerated, pre-trial individuals, had never ever voted in their lives. Before 2008, no one in Sumter County ever registered people at our jails, had never done so. So it was and still is a journey. And go ahead, please.
I'd say that makes a lot of sense, and it really is this active effort. Tori, how common is it to find communities like Dr. Williams's around the country where people are either disengaged or excluded from the franchise because of laws or procedures, except for when someone like Dr. Williams comes in and really tries to connect with them on this way?
Well, I'll start by saying that our entire democracy would look a lot different if we had a Dr. Williams in each and every community across the United States. Unfortunately, it's all too common that there are communities that are not reached by the political system, are not given equal access to the ballot. And that comes down to a few things that we see top down from how voting rights are defined or aren't defined at the national level, and the fact that they're administered at such a local level. So while the right to vote, we feel is very fundamental in the United States, the way that it's framed in the Constitution is not in positive terms. There's nowhere in the Constitution where it says you have a fundamental right to vote. We have multiple amendments that say you can't be denied that right because of race or age, gender, but that affirmative phrase is not in there anywhere. And that's why things like the passage of the Voting Rights Act 55 years ago was so fundamental to giving litigators like myself or community organizers, the communities that have been historically disenfranchised under the law before those amendments were passed, more tools to protect their right to vote. But even with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, it's been chipped away at in recent years through court decisions or through Congress's failure to restore some of the pieces that have been chipped away at through recent decisions. So right now, these communities that Dr. Williams has been dedicating her time to enfranchising, or worse off, the communities that don't have a Dr. Williams in there to do that work, are the same ones that right now are being undercounted on the census. And that census will determine their access to power and to funds. And all of these things compound and build off a history of racial discrimination, of class-based discrimination, of all these different interacting factors that determine access to power. And that power is so intrinsic to who has access to the right to vote. So if you don't have that power to get the access to the right to vote, you also need that power to vote in the first place. All of these things combined, and too much of the work is left to folks like Dr. Williams or to litigators rather than the government or our leaders, who are too often focused on maintaining their power rather than making sure that each and every voter has equal access to a fundamental constitutional right to vote.
That makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned some recent court decisions. You know, we talk about the Voting Rights Act. Today's the anniversary. When did you start seeing these new-ish laws, newly implemented laws that are restricting the right to vote? And why are they able to be passed and implemented even though we have the Voting Rights Act?
So unfortunately, each chapter of American history has seen new forms of voter intimidation, voter suppression, and often these efforts have been directed at communities of color, Black voters especially, the same folks who had to fight for the passage of the Voting Rights Act and for each and every step closer to a fundamental right to vote. A real tipping point in terms of our history of voting rights and an unfortunate kind of plot twist in our work was 2013, when the Supreme Court heard the Shelby County case that was regarding certain provisions of the Voting Rights Act, including Section 4 and 5. So because of the Shelby County decision, the Supreme Court determined that a formula that was used to decide which states or jurisdictions had such an egregious history of voter suppression that they needed to essentially get permission from the federal government before making any changes to their voting laws or administrative procedures. The formula that decided who was in that selective group of worst offenders, that formula was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But they didn't get rid of that idea that some states might be so bad that they need extra permission. It's called pre-clearance. The idea that you have to have a voting procedure pre-cleared by the federal government before you can enact it. That concept prevails, even post-Shelby, but it doesn't apply to anyone right now because Congress hasn't acted to create a new formula that would make certain states like South Carolina, or Dr. Williams is, or Louisiana, where I do a lot of my work, required to go through that extra step. Without pre-clearance, we've lost this huge tool where the federal government could take proactive measures to stop bad laws or procedures from going into effect before the harm was done. So much of the work has now been delegated to advocates, litigators, whomever is working in this voting rights, civil rights, and racial justice space to do that investigation and that intervention. But too often it's after the harm is done, after the law is in place, after the polling site has been moved or something else has caused harm to voting rights, that those interventions can be made. So in the absence of pre-clearance, in the absence of congressional action to restore that formula, we just have less tools to protect the right to vote. And the VRA, that was such an incredible accomplishment 55 years ago, and really after was the strongest piece of civil rights legislation we've seen in this country. You know, it's just not the tool it once was, but it could be again if action was taken.
That makes a lot of sense, and seems like a little legal gymnastics for people that aren't familiar with this. Pre-clearance is still there. It just doesn't apply to any states. And of course, Dr. Williams, you've seen these changes happen in real time as you've been organizing and working in your community. I'm thinking, you know, closing of polling stations, the voter ID laws, also, you know, all the stuff. Could you explain a little bit about what it's been like navigating these changes in real time and helping other people navigate them?
Yeah, the navigation of the voting rights changes in South Carolina has been very, very difficult, interesting. I want to mention that in our efforts to help the voters in South Carolina deal with the voter ID law that South Carolina put into fruition in 2011, they put out the thought that they're going to have voter ID as a prerequisite for voters. My husband and I immediately recognized the fact that this would be problematic for many of our patients, many of whom were elderly people who were delivered by midwives in rural South Carolina, who never ever had birth certificates. They never ever had formal birth certificates with a seal. Why? Because back 60, 70, 80 years ago, the recognition of births of Black people in the South wasn't really important to the politicians back then, because Black people were not considered first-class citizens. We were considered less than a normal citizen. So the births of many people went unrecorded, or when it went recorded, there were so many errors in spelling, like John might have been J-O-N instead of J-O-H-N. Some patients had baby girl Kennedy as a name on her birth certificate, baby boy Brown. And so often during that time, 2011, 2012, people kind of freaked out across the nation. They said, what's the big deal? Anybody can get a photo ID. You have to have a photo ID to buy your medicine. Well, it wasn't so easy. When you get a photo ID, particularly going through the Department of Motor Vehicles, there is a requirement to have a birth certificate, a certified birth certificate. Well, that was a problem for at least 200 of our patients who were born, who had Social Security numbers, they got Medicare, they worked for 30, 40 years for the post office, et cetera, but they never, ever had a birth certificate. So we had to, and I had a learning curve because I really didn't understand the process, the problems that people had to go through to get a birth certificate. We ended up spending, my husband and I, using our credit card, Visa credit card, well over $50,000 in a year, just trying to help our patients get the documentation necessary to get amended birth certificates or delayed birth certificates. We had to hire attorneys. Why did we spend our own money? Basically because it's a convoluted process in getting birth certificates. We had to hire attorneys to take patients through the family court to get the necessary documentation, then go to the Social Security office and have them to do their paperwork, et cetera, and then to get those persons to the DMV. It was and still is a process wherein we have to educate people about elections, about the electoral process. These are individuals who had never, ever had politicians running for office pay any attention to them. The politicians went elsewhere for their attention, but came to the Black community and put up their signs saying, vote for Mr. such and such, Mrs. such and such. So there is an inequality that still exists. We talk about the absentee votes. Well, those in jail could vote by no other means other than absentee. We ended up registering and helping over 7,000 pretrial inmates at the Sumter Lee Regional Detention Center here in Sumter. We were very, very honored to have the director of the jail to work with us very enthusiastically to help us to get into the jails, to educate the voters. We even bought little books, the United States Constitution and Declaration of Independence books. We bought hundreds of them at $2.99 a piece. And we distributed them to inmates, to also to correctional officers, who many of whom were not familiar with the electoral process. And so voting in South Carolina, we're still dealing with the absentee issue. And we're going to get to that pretty soon. I'm sure you have some questions on that.
Yes, absolutely I do. I think a lot of people will be shocked at how much effort and money it took you as just an outside activist person concerned to try and help these people vote. And let's definitely zero in more on the absentee voting in South Carolina, because of course you used it to help inmates, pretrial and jail vote. But with the coronavirus, a lot of people are going to be using this system. Could you walk us through the steps that it takes to cast an absentee ballot in South Carolina?
Yes, I certainly will. It's a convolution of steps. First of all, those who wish to vote by way of absentee have to meet one of 18 categories. Not just anybody could go and say that they want to vote this way. Many people do not understand the difference between absentee voting and early voting. We don't have early voting here. We absentee, you have to meet a certain criteria Either you are over the age of 65, or you're going out of town and can't be in town on election day, or you might be hospitalized, or you have some other reason, or you might be pretrial inmate. You have to meet those criteria. And as a result of that, many people are excluded from that. There is no way of verifying whether or not someone is telling the truth. They might say, well, I have to vote, I have to go out of town, I have to be at work, etc. Absentee also requires the individual putting in an application. It's called a request for absentee ballot, which one has to either call in or fax in or email in to the voter registration office for a request for an absentee ballot application. Then that comes through the mail. Then the voter has to sign that and mail that back in. Then when voting time comes, which is 30 days before the election, the voter has to get a ballot and find someone to witness the signing of that ballot. Now, that is not as easy as it sounds. 4 years ago, in 2016, during the general election, I just mentioned that I helped, by the grace of God, thousands of inmates and have gone through thousands of absentee ballots, but it was one absentee ballot that I forgot to put my home address on the voter's oath envelope. Mind you, I witnessed the voter voting, but I forgot, for goodness sake, to put my home address on the voter's oath envelope, and as a result of that, the voter's ballot was not counted. I felt that that was entirely unconstitutional, entirely wrong, and started on a journey, a mission, a research quest to find out how many voters in the state of South Carolina had absentee ballots discarded because of that witness signature being absent. I found that there were thousands of voters whose ballots were discarded because of the absence of a witness signature, something as trivial as that. The state of South Carolina's election commission also agrees that the absentee, that witness signature, has no value, and it is not such a thing that can be verified. Mm-hmm. Even as of now, we are battling that in court. And I'm going to say this, and I'll let you go ahead. In June of this year, with the COVID-19 pandemic being in place nationwide, worldwide, particularly in areas, hotspots like Sumter, South Carolina, the governor of our state enacted a mandate saying that for the June primary only, the witness signature would no longer be mandatory. And also, voters could vote by way of the absentee ballot without having to fit one of those categories. And the one category the governor did add, if a voter wanted to vote by absentee in June of this year, he or she had to check a box saying that it was due to an emergency. Mm-hmm. And that was, we had to go through court. The legal NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund and the American Civil Liberties Union represented our group. We were so honored, along with several wonderful voters in this lawsuit.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. It really shows how a small procedure or bureaucratic decision can disenfranchise a lot of people. So basically, if you want to vote absentee in South Carolina, you need to sign the envelope with your ballot. You need a witness to watch you do all this and sign it. You need that witness to give their address. And you need, before you qualify for any of that, one of these excuses. And across the United States, there are many other states with similar systems, and a global pandemic is not one of those pre-approved excuses, which is makes sense. No one expected this, but as so many people will be transitioning to this absentee system for their own safety or the safety of others or vulnerable people in their families, we're seeing responses. You mentioned briefly the legal action in Sumter in South Carolina. Tori, could you expand a little more about what else we're seeing across the country? I've heard voting rights lawyers say that it's always busy during election years, but this year in particular, there's a lot more action, and I feel, at least from what I'm seeing, a different sense of urgency with this litigation.
Well, there's absolutely new urgency because people's lives are literally on the line here. We're seeing the right to vote being put in tension with people's right to protect their health and protect the health of not only the families who they may live in a home with, but their whole communities. This is a virus like one this generation has never seen. And we're learning new things about it every day. So adapting to different guidance about whether or not your children can go to school, whether or not you can enter a grocery store without a mask on, whether or not washing your hands is the best guidance or a sanitizer is accessible, all of those things are new. Our whole country and really our whole world, we're being forced to adapt to a whole new way of living. And we're also trying to figure out a whole new way of voting for many of us. But the thing is, many of the tools that would make this a lot easier, states have already contemplated. They've already had vote by mail as an opportunity, but a privileged opportunity that's exclusive to some, or that's a lot easier for folks who have someone who they live with, who is of age to be able to sign as their witness, versus someone who's living by themselves and being told that they should self-isolate so that they aren't putting themselves and their communities and others at risk of virus transmission. So across the country, across the voting rights bar and community of advocates, there was already plenty that was going to be on the plate this year to make sure that each and every voter has complete access to the ballot for all elections this year, which are far beyond just November 3rd, but certainly that one is top of mind. But having COVID-19 added to the mix meant that we had to consider, what does voting look like in a crisis, and how do we make sure that folks can exercise that right safely? That government guidance is not in conflict. And what's been a frustration and led to litigation in places like South Carolina or Louisiana or Alabama, Texas, the list goes on. And the list correlates a lot with that same list of states that would have had to go through a preclearance requirement before the Shelby decision. Those states are either dragging their heels when it comes to expanding vote by mail or making it confusing and burdensome for folks. So they're keeping the witness requirements intact, or they're making a limited amount of categories that apply to some folks who have preconditions, but not their family members who could be forced to vote in person and then bring the virus back, or not to each and every American voter who is vulnerable to this virus. We have learned, we have been taught that anyone can catch it and you might not be symptomatic. So you could be at risk of spreading it to others. And that's horrifying. And needing to navigate that kind of consideration for yourself as an individual, your family, your close community, but then your broader global community as well. When just trying to exercise your right to vote, it shouldn't be that burdensome on a practical level, on an emotional level, and not in a flourishing, or what should be a flourishing democracy that's committed to making sure that folks can exercise their right to vote. It just should be simpler, and people should be able to utilize tools that already exist and just need to be expanded.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And when you think of these issues, and maybe some people that, especially if you're not from the United States, you might be wondering, why is just South Carolina acting? And then why is someone else just focusing on Louisiana? It's because every state has their own system in litigation. And that's why some states have also moved their primaries, delayed them in the summer, and taking those individual actions. Are there any cases, Tori, you'd like to highlight, maybe cases that have already been resolved with some positive benefits to expand access to absentee voting in these delayed primaries we've seen this summer, or something else you're looking for forward in the litigation space?
Well, the list of cases is far more expansive than I could even keep track of. But from LDF, the Legal Defense Fund's docket alone, we've had almost half a dozen cases just specific to the pandemic, whether that's in South Carolina or Alabama, Louisiana. In these states, filing of litigation has sometimes led to legislative action. So in South Carolina, the legislature did expand some of the voting qualifications for the earlier primary elections in the state, but didn't remove that witness requirement. So we still had to go to court for that. And for so many of these states where we've seen a little bit of adjustment, the primary has been delayed, or there's been an expansion of early voting days, in-person early voting days, or qualifications to vote absentee, those changes were made for our early elections. So whether it's electing your local town officials or your state officials, or casting a ballot to determine who you want to be in our presidential election, at all those levels, elections have been happening across the country on different days as early as the first months of the year. And there's been accommodations made in those moments, but they haven't been extended to November. So even if we had little wins in the courts or in legislatures or through executive actions, there's still ambiguity in many states about what the protections are going to be in November. And in the meantime, we've seen the virus move across the country. We've seen the rates of death skyrocket, especially in Black and Brown communities, in ways that are scary and devastating and leave us still with so many questions about what November, December, and beyond will look like in terms of the virus. But we shouldn't have all those questions about what our plan to vote is going to be and what the safest way to exercise our right to vote will be for our families, for ourselves, and our communities. So unfortunately, there hasn't been just a wave of solutions brought at any level of our political process, but we have seen some gains, and we're keeping up that momentum to try to make sure that that same level of access, if not more, preferably more, is allowed for voters across all these different states and local communities in November and beyond.
That makes
And I'd like to mention, Brittany, something that Tori mentioned, that coronavirus affected our own family. My husband, who is an internist and a geriatrician, came down with COVID-19 early in April. As a matter of fact, April 4th, he received that diagnosis after admitting several patients that same week who were infected with COVID and needed hospitalization. After he got through with his quarantine, I came down with COVID. And all at the same time, we opened a free, before we came down with COVID, we'd opened up a free medical clinic, and which we still hold, and which has become even more important in that there's so many people who have lost their jobs because of COVID-19. So many businesses have gone out of service. And with these jobs that these individuals have lost, so has their insurance, medical insurance, been lost. And so we are seeing an influx of individuals who have no job and no health insurance, many of whom are now becoming infected with COVID. As I mentioned, this is a hot spot. It's so hot in reference to that pandemic. Our schools will now open up virtually for the first time ever because of COVID-19. And so when we go out into, when we even think about going out into the community to register people, educate them about voting and education about politics, etc., we have a double whammy. to deal with. We have the COVID-19, we have to do the social distancing. We were out of commission for at least a month and a half, my husband and myself, dealing with COVID. So that threw us behind. I'm way behind in going out to the jail. Fortunately, there hadn't been many inmates out there who have been infected, but there have been some. There have been some correctional officers, unfortunately, who have been infected with COVID, some sheriff deputies, etc. And so we are thrown into this situation wherein our job, our duties, our responsibilities to the public, to our citizens, to help them with voting had been put on the back burner for a while so we can deal with educating people about COVID, providing the care that they need.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. It's impossible to ignore that the demographics most affected by COVID, as well as the demographics most affected by voter suppression, is quite an overlapping group.
Yes.
So you're really in the center of everything. There have been some primaries. There was a primary in South Carolina in June, and elections across the country during COVID elections. What have we learned, and what can we learn for November based on what we've seen in elections so far this summer, and also in your organizing efforts so far this summer, Dr. Williams?
Yes, well, we've learned quite a bit. I started sending letters to the directors for the voter registration and elections offices throughout the state. We have 46 counties in South Carolina. And last week, might have been about 8 days ago now, I sent letters. I always communicate with the directors for voter registration and elections in the state of South Carolina. This is not the first time. I've done it since 2008, finding out what's going on in these counties. Had there been any changes electoral wise, et cetera. The most recent letter was sent in reference to whether or not these counties in the state of South Carolina are ready to deal with the influx of voters that will be coming this year, particularly in the fall, in the November election. I asked questions about how prepared are these voter registration and election offices in training the poll workers. The poll workers will be inundated with things they have to do in reference to COVID-19. They'll be handling ballots. They'll be seeing people coming in voting in person. And it's very, very urgent to educate those poll workers and at the same time pay them more money. They're having to get trained more, and so they're going to have to work longer hours and deserve better pay. The state of South Carolina has allotted, I understand, $15 million to be spread across the state in reference to extra training for the poll workers. There were 6 questions in the inquiry that I sent, and it was, do you have enough poll workers? Do you think that you're going to need more money? Do you think that you will be able to count the absentee ballots on election day? Is that enough time? It's going to be a storm of voters coming in who had never, ever voted by absentee before. Why they're voting for it now? Because of COVID. So I asked the directors, do you all think that you have enough time to do adequate and sufficient and efficient counting of votes on one day, November 3rd? The overwhelming answer is no.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yes, the directors, and so far, I sent out 46 inquiries. So far, I've gotten back about 10, and they're slow to come in, but they're thinking over the answer. And they are glad that somebody asked the question. And the suggestions, I asked the directors for voter registration and election in South Carolina, what do you think we need to do to make voting easier and smoother for the voters? And the overwhelming answer so far that have come in has been, well, the Election Commission, along with the voter registration offices, need to put it out on social media, TV, Twitter, Facebook, etc. We need to get the politicians, the South Carolina legislature, to pass a law which will allow the votes, the absentee votes, to be counted even at least a week before the election day. Some folk recommend 2 weeks before the election day. Some folk recommend a couple of days before the election day. And our suspicions are that it's going to take excuse the word, a hell of a lot of patience and time in counting those votes. And so the legislature, and I'm going to say this, in January, surprisingly, I read an article today that I hadn't read before. It was I think it was in the Charleston Courier. I might have that wrong, Charlotte Courier, but anyway, where legislators were contemplating then. That was even before COVID hit
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And a lot of states have laws.
Yeah, that was an article I think that I read, you sent to me, I think someone sent to me. And I saw that they were saying then they're going to need more time for the voter registration and election commissions to count the absentee ballots. So the legislators need to get on the stick right now, and pass this legislation.
That makes a lot of sense. And a lot of states have those similar laws for restricting counting, and poll workers will be a problem, especially they're usually an older group. Tori, is there anything else you'd like to add to that? Looking forward to November.
I think only building off of those same themes, the poll workers, election officials are worried about time, but I think that as voters, making a plan and making it early to, number one, make sure you know your voting rights and if they've changed. If the qualifications to vote by mail are now accessible to you, make a plan early, whether or not that's how you plan to vote. But if you're planning on voting in person, figure out early what time you plan to vote, find out what your polling site is. Has it changed? Polling site changes have been a theme this year as well, because many have been moved out of senior living centers or otherwise changed to be able to accommodate social distancing and other things that are related to this crisis. So the more that voters can make a plan of how they can vote, how they want to vote, and how they can exercise the full extent of their voting rights, that's work that can be done now rather than waiting until November 2nd or the morning of November 3rd. And I think too, we need more Dr. Williams in the world. Maybe you don't have the capacity to register 7,000 voters in the community jail, but if you can at least check in with your friends about whether or not they also have a plan to vote, or if you are comfortable and of the health to be able to volunteer to be a poll worker in your community, which is not always paid as much as it should be, but is a paid position, figuring out how you can sign up for that now and do that work and go above and beyond just casting a ballot. That's that kind of extra credit work that builds and builds and builds and shifts power in the country, and also builds new habits for folks to feel more empowered with all of their voting rights and more able to spread that access to the ballot to others. So I think, you know, we're learning in this moment new habits about how to vote, but hopefully the practice of thinking about voting more year round and making sure that you're spreading that knowledge to others are good habits that can come out of a crisis moment.
Excellent. Building off of that, Tori, we have a question from Jasminka. I think I said that correctly. Sorry if I didn't. She asks, what can we do to support efforts to combat voter suppression and to help get out the vote? In the absence of foreign election monitors, is there space for us to help in person, by phone, or with research media efforts?
Absolutely. I think there are a variety of different ways that you can support efforts. LDF has ways in which you can sign up with us to be channeled to our partners who are hopefully going to be doing some on the ground work in their communities. But again, we're trying to adapt to see which things we can do remotely, what ways we can support voters, even from our computers, whether that's reaching out with information, sharing information, amplifying know your rights information from your computer, from your phone, from whatever you're tuning into this from. There's work that can be done that way, but really focusing locally. If you are in the United States, voting anywhere, so many of the issues we face are super local. There are about one polling site that didn't get the right extension cords it needed in time for polls to open. We saw that happen in Georgia, or polling sites moving right on the eve of an election and that not even being articulated up to the Secretary of State's office to then make sure it's in the proper portal for folks to look up their polling site. We saw that in Louisiana just weeks ago. These things happen super locally, and they don't always trickle up to the advocacy groups that are trying to respond to these issues if we have to in the courts, but also sometimes just through the voter education work. So if you can figure out how to tune into local election officials' meetings or to hold your local officials accountable, the fact that Dr. Williams is asking questions and forcing all of these across the state officials to be accountable to having plans early on, that kind of work you can do in and of your own community, and you don't necessarily need to wait from the go-ahead from LDF or the family unit or some other organization to do it. You can hold your election officials accountable, and that could be from the poll worker to the county election officials to the Secretary of State. It's not just up at the federal level or on a nationwide level. So there are plenty of ways to get involved. Be a poll worker, make sure you're registered. Go online right now and check your registration status and make sure it hasn't changed, that you weren't purged for one reason or another. All those type of systematic purges that would affect large swaths of people were supposed to happen by yesterday. So this is a moment to be double checking those things, making your plan, and then spreading all that knowledge.
Absolutely. It sounds like we need the Dr. Williams
Yes.
book on letter writing and email writing to officials.
Yes.
Precisely.
And I wanted to mention, I'm so glad that someone in the listening audience is interested, finding out what can I do, how, when, why, where can I fit in, how can I help? There are, as Tori mentioned, ways to get the word out there. If you're not registered, go ahead and register now. There's a deadline in South Carolina. If you're not registered by October 2nd, actually, to vote, you won't be qualified or eligible to vote in November. November is a big election. We are voting for president and governor, and there's so many elections out there, so very important. But you have to be registered by a certain time, and that's October 2nd in South Carolina. There are ways to find out if your vote was counted. That's one thing also that I have been checking into on behalf of our organization. There is a special form, I learned about this about 4 years ago, called the Voter Registration and Elections Management Systems. It's a long term, but it's a form that voters have the right to have. You get it from the Voter Registration and Election Office. And on that form, it will let you know the election that you voted in and whether or not your vote was counted. If your vote was not counted, there is a reason behind that. And all persons, check with me, Brenda Williams, Family Unit Inc. That's INC, Family Unit Inc. at gmail.com. Family Unit Inc. at gmail.com. Call me, 803-968-3375. We're on Facebook. The Family Unit Inc. is on Facebook. We're about helping you learn what voting is about. We've also given away some homes, 6 homes in the past 8 years, just trying to help people who live in poverty and despair be raised up and empowered and enfranchised. There are ways to get around the problem, just like with the voter ID issue. In South Carolina, we went to court, South Carolina versus Holder. We were on the side of Attorney General Holder, of course. And a very important thing happened in that case. South Carolina was putting into action the reasonable impediment exemption, which is very important for voters to know. Voters that did not have a photo ID issued by the state of South Carolina could still vote in the place of a photo ID. That person could have a reasonable impediment. You might not have been able to get a photo ID because of various and sundry reasons, and whatever reason the voter says goes in South Carolina. Not unless you have been proven to be lying, and that is very rare because the election commissions don't go into investigations to see whether or not a voter is telling the truth or not. Most people tell the truth. There are some of us that fudge the truth every now and then. It started even as a kid. Did you eat that cookie with crumbs all over the mouth? No, I didn't eat the cookie. But most people are truthful. Most people are reliable. And so we as a family unit want others to delve into voting. I want to say this, put in a little plug for a documentary entitled One Vote. It's coming out in 2 days on iTunes and on Amazon, on Vudu, and it's entitled One Vote. And we talk about the importance of the ballot, just how important that is. And no matter whether or not you're a Democrat or Republican or independent, you have the right to vote your convictions. And look up onevote.us. It's a very good documentary coming out in just a couple of days. Thank you.
Great. It looks like it's about time to wrap up. So I'll just end with one final question, just to kind of wrap it up. When we talk about voting rights and we're talking about absentee and mail-in ballots and looking forward to November, one thing that gets talked about a lot, mostly because of President Trump, is voter fraud. He's tweeted numerous times about how there's tremendous voter fraud and absentee and mail-in ballots. So just in a very quick way, we know that voter fraud does not exist at the scale or the degree that he is talking about. Studies from the Brennan Center have found that it is virtually non-existent. One study from 2014 that looked at 1 billion ballots cast found 31 cases of voter fraud. Another study estimated that it's about a 0.00003% of occurrences. So considering all of that, even when President Trump talks about it this way, how does it affect our elections, just having that rhetoric out there?
That rhetoric is very, very destructive. And it's lies upon lies. Those of us who are in this world who deal with truth would do some fact checking. Just do a fact checking. Google it. Anytime president, or not just a president, anyone who comes out with any kind of statement, fact check it, read, study, and you'll find what the real truth is. But I feel very confident that Americans have enough sense to look beyond the fog, to look beyond the lies, to look beyond the deceit. And we'll show it when we go to the polls.
Tori?
I'll just say, if we could start with the baseline of the truth, we can spend so much more time equipping voters with the tools that they need, informing them of the rights that they have to exercise at the ballot box, instead of spending so much time trying to unwrite falsehoods, or to reshift the angle towards something that is real data about how folks' lives are being impacted by this crisis and how that overlaps with their access to the ballot, rather than negligible, non-existent data points about this falsehood of fraud. So I think just pivoting the conversation to think that, you know, the greatest fraud is acting like a nation that is committed to making sure each and every voter is equally enfranchised in this democracy, rather than one that is distracting from that. Like that correction, and committing ourselves as voters to having a baseline of truth and building from there, rather than getting caught in the weeds of lies and falsehoods, just gives us so much more room to do good work, to get voters out and to participate ourselves, rather than be distracted by false claims of fraud, or worries ourselves that just exercising our right to vote could get us caught up in a system that is not one that we would ever be in, because that fraud doesn't exist and our intentions are never to do anything other than just exercise our own power. So it's a distraction, but we remain focused, and we have folks like Dr. Williams who are doing that good work every day, and everyone who's watching now who is a registered voter or who knows Americans could be, can do that work to build power and to get to the ballot box November 3rd and beyond.
Great. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you, Dr. Brenda Williams, Tori Wenger, and Brittany Gibson. Really great information and so inspiring, and so many resources in our chat that we need to now keep following up on. And thanks to our audience too. We know we didn't get to all of your questions. This, as I mentioned, this is a recorded session, and we're hoping to add some answers to some of those questions we didn't get to when we post the video on pulitzercenter.org. I also want to thank my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, including Holly Peipenberg, who is our executive producer for today, and also to our donors who support our work, including the Art for Justice Fund, which has supported this series this summer, and our reporting and education outreach on mass incarceration and related justice issues. We appreciate all of our audience today, and as I mentioned, we're a nonprofit, so if you are able to support us in any manner, please do so. Please do stay with us for a few moments longer after we officially conclude, because we will have that brief survey to get your ideas from us or to us, and also visit thepulitzercenter.org about next events we'll be holding in the months ahead. And of course, share with your friends both what you've heard today and going forward on what you're listening to. So thanks again for being with us, and have a good afternoon.
And thank you.
Thanks again.